Good morning. My name's Chris Giles. I'm the economics editor of the Financial Times. It's my great pleasure this morning to be introducing this session and the guest speaker today, Andrew MORAVCSIK, who is the director of the European Union program at Princeton University and a professor of politics there too. Andrew will be speaking on the question why populist foreign policies are doomed to disappoint. And for the extremely eagle-eyed among you, you'll notice that's a slight different title from the program, which is Are Populist Foreign Policies Doomed to Fail? So whether we're now slightly moderating our views a little bit, this Andrew will be able to enlighten us in the next 45 minutes or so. I don't think I'll be revealing many secrets to tell you that Andrew's view will not delight the populists in the audience today, nor the wannabe populists, but will maybe provide some succor to those of us, and I include myself in this, who believe the world is a complex, not a simple place, and that broad-based, evidence-based policies are a better way to go. It's been a mixed week, and there's been a lot of action in foreign policy and where populists have taken control in the world just in the past week. There's been a lot of action in the US. Late on Thursday, we had the president announcing new tariffs on Mexico to come in place in 10 days' time, all to do with immigration on the southern border and whether Mexico is sufficiently controlling the flow of migrants from the rest of Latin America. In my own country, in the UK, we've seen the fall of a prime minister in the past week on the failure of her Brexit policies. I think that's a very easy thing to conclude. And yet she's likely to be replaced by a more populist candidate still. And in Europe, we've had the European elections a week ago, which didn't provide the breakthrough for populism that was widely expected, but neither did it kill populist parties either. So I can't think of a better person here to help us think through the issues than Andrew MORAVCSIK. Apart from his top-of-the-range academic work, he's also been a journalist and is the European Book Review editor at Foreign Policy, but also been a practical policymaker for the European Commission, the US government, the Trade Department, and South Korea. And also, Andrew is a wonderful speaker, so I think we're in for a bit of a treat this morning. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here. I'm glad to see so many of you here, particularly students there in the back. If I were you, I would be up hiking in the mountains on a beautiful day like this, not hearing about populism. I take it the reason so many people are here is because this is a big issue, and many people at this conference have spoken about it. And I want to make today, adding to that, a very simple point. The simple point is the following: that in foreign policy, democratic populist policies, or right-wing populist policies particularly, appear to be unsustainable. Specifically, and I want to be clear, I'm speaking about democratic regimes, so we're not talking about Putin or Turkey or any of that, but in democratic societies. We're talking about foreign policy. So we could have an interesting discussion about domestic policy, and I think something similar may be true, but I'm going to talk about foreign policy. So the argument is that populist leaders fail to implement most of their concrete policies. And in fact, they eventually adopt something very much like the policies of the opposition or those who criticize them. That's the basic puzzle that I want to address. The interesting part, I think, is why. Why this must happen, in my view. Now, before I get to that one thing, right-wing nationalists, so I won't talk about left-wing governments. I want to be very precise and focused. And I'm also following Cass Mude, who talked yesterday, who relates populism to right-wing governments, and fail to implement foreign policy promises. So the interesting question is why? Why must this happen? And I'm going to argue that populists are defined by a particular electoral rhetoric which makes some assumptions about foreign policy. They have an implicit foreign policy doctrine. And when they get into office, it turns out that the fundamental principles of that foreign policy doctrine are wrong. And they have to adapt. They adapt. In some cases, they don't get elected at all because of their foreign policy position. In other cases, they go into coalitions and find that other people don't agree with it. In other cases, they try to implement it and fail. And in many cases, they end up then ultimately changing their view. So this is a particular syndrome that doesn't just occur by chance. It must occur. And finally, in closing, I'm going to raise the issue of why nobody seems to notice that populist foreign policies are, as we say in English, all bark and no bite. Okay, so I want to give one example at the start of what's, I think, the archetypal case of a populist foreign policy that proves unsustainable, which is Brexit. So I think we can say now that unless policy just spins out of control and gets made by accident, the future legal status of Britain may be inside the European Union or outside the European Union. But it is increasingly likely that the policies that Britain pursues will be very similar to the policies it pursues now. Most of the radical proposals for pulling out of the EU across the board and rearranging Britain's policies entirely with other great powers have now fallen by the wayside. The parliamentary choice now really is to do nothing or to adopt something like Theresa May's proposal, maybe something even softer than that. There's much less bite to the Brexit bark than we would have thought. This is referred to as the Hotel California effect. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. My favorite one actually is the Financial Times. I think it was Wolfgang Munchau who said Brexit has become Brino, Brexit in name only. And what I'm going to argue is that's the point, right? For these people like this, the best political outcome is to bark but not to bite. That for all of them, they have a nationalist base that supports the barking, but they must rule in alliance with people who are concerned about the pragmatic politics of what actually happens when you try to implement something. And those people will not be satisfied unless the policy is watered down. That's why most of these people have disappeared from the domestic political scene. And even if Boris Johnson comes back, my betting would be he'll find some way to soften Brexit. I think the same is true for all these other democratic populists. Instead of going through each case now, I'm going to raise issues about them during the talk, showing that all of them have watered down what it is they proposed to do. So again, the basic thesis here is that barking and not biting is the optimal political strategy for a populist once they get into office. So they bark in the election, they continue to bark when they're in office, but they don't bite. And that's because barking satisfies the populist base, while not biting satisfies the popular, better informed interest groups and avoids public failure of policies that would call the whole thing into question. Here's a wonderful cartoon about barking and biting. Because I thought there might be some students here, I put it up because it's actually done by a first-year student at Boston University, published in the student paper. But it's typical of an example of Trump barking a lot, but actually, if you look at US policy toward North Korea today, it's essentially exactly the same policy with exactly the same options as the two previous American administrations faced. And his rhetoric is no more credible than that of his opponent. Now, before I go into the details of this analysis, let me just make a few caveats. First, populists do implement some symbolic or incomplete or weak policies. Some examples are moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem. You get a lot of headlines for saying that you're going to move the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It has very little practical import. Calling President Macron a hypocrite, it may be true or not, but it's not a major substantive foreign policy action. And somewhat controversially, migrant quotas. EU migrant quotas, unlike EU restrictions on migration, external migration, were always a policy designed to apply to only a very small number of migrants, only for the initial purpose of checking them. It was seen both by proponents and opponents, proponents in Germany, opponents in Hungary, as a form of political cover for their situation. It's not actually a significant policy and never was. There are also some policies that populists do implement because everybody supports them. Again, controversially, restrictions on migration. Restrictions on migration are something that every political party in the Western world, in the entire OECD world, implements whatever they say they're doing. So the previous Italian government was no different than the current Italian government in its external migration policy. The previous American government restricted migration very forcibly under Obama. So my view is that that's a general policy, not something specific to populists. And finally, of course, we can wonder what President Trump or somebody else, Matteo Salvini, would do in a foreign policy crisis. We don't know, although actually the North Korean case is relatively reassuring. So there are these cases like immigration where you can see here in almost every country there's an extraordinarily large, by comparison to other issues, support for no increased migration. And so that policy is not something distinctively populist. But in all other areas where populists make distinctive proposals, it's bark and not bite. Okay, so if that's the case, why? Why is this true? And this is, I think, where we really learn something about the essence of populism. So my argument, again, is that populists have one set of incentives when they talk to voters and another set of incentives when they implement policy. They have a foreign policy doctrine that they use rhetorically, and then when they implement, they're subject to the same constraints as most other people. So when speaking to voters, what is the distinctive foreign policy doctrine of right-wing populists? And I think it has two elements. The first is that the goals nations seek are based on simple, intuitive, and consensual goals. And these goals are rooted in the values or interests or policy solutions of the nation. So populists don't like to think that policy comes out of some complex compromise between different interest groups domestically. They think of policy as being clearly derived from simple values that are in the minds of the majority of the population. So there's a great deal of consensus at home in this view, and there is the opposite internationally, that international negotiations are conflictual, in the game theoretic sense, zero-sum, and the more determined countries win the bargaining fights over these policies. So you can see that in all cases, populists pick fights with people about issues because they view those issues as being fundamentally more conflictual than do people of other persuasions. So, simple, intuitive, and consensual national goals. Why? Well, because one reason is that populists appeal to goals that are symbolic and general to the nation. Things like nation, sovereignty, interdependence, identity. But some populists also make arguments about the material world that imply all domestic actors should be on the same side. For example, when Trump says we want higher trade surpluses or less migration, he makes this argument in terms of the nation as a whole, not saying it's good for these people or not good for those people or anything like that. And these solutions are, in the eyes of populists, as they sell them to voters, simple and intuitive. Simple solutions to simple problems that track simple goals. You close the borders, you leave the EU, you pull out of NATO. Those are typical solutions of this school. So here's some examples. Think about how the Brexiteers talk about Brexit. They don't say, well, on balance, we think this will be beneficial for us. They use rhetoric like, we need to be a fully independent, self-governing country. We need to take back proper democratic control. And these rhetorical appeals translate directly into voting on the part of individuals. So if we look at polls about why voters voted the way they did, something like defending sovereignty, the principle that decisions about the UK should be taken in the UK is the most strongest reason defended by Brexit voters, the strongest reason defended by Leave voters for voting as they did, right? A simple ideal, not a calculation of interest. Similarly with controls over border and immigration. And the Brexit solution is simple, just leave. Brexit is Brexit, right? So the appeal of this ideology electorally is that it is a simple set of solutions to problems that are supposed to appeal to all of us. You can see this also in France. Here we have some quotations from Marine Le Pen. I'm sorry about leaving them in French. But you can see that the rhetoric is the same, although more French, that she views the world as nations united by a single culture. People pursue goals they've pursued for centuries that are culturally unified. And therefore, people defend the liberty to defend this identity as against these international organizations that lack these qualities and that do terrible things like speaking English. So this is an appeal, again, a simple appeal to a simple general value. Trump has the same kind of rhetorical appeal. He says every American should support making America great again. Like, who can oppose making America great again? Every American ought to get behind that. And he tends to formulate goals, as I said before, in this zero-sum, but also unified domestic manner. So that's the first element. Then the second element of the populist appeal is that international politics is conflictual. It's hostile. It's zero-sum. Why? Because in the world, those values, like nation and history and culture, are distinct to individual countries. They necessarily conflict. The purpose of the nation is to defend those values. And in the, because there's no common ground between different values or between zero-sum material interests. It's the more determined parties that prevail in these kinds of conflicts. So the populist appeal is very much that in this conflictual world, we care more about this, so we're going to defend you. And again, Brexit is a great example. You can see the rhetoric is so zero-sum. One person favors Britain, one person favors Europe. The alternative is subservience. And people are always quoting Winston Churchill. So here's one lesson for you from this talk. When politicians quote Winston Churchill, they're in trouble and you're in trouble. Because Winston Churchill is exactly this kind of thinker, right? Somebody who was wrong about almost everything in his political career until he got to World War II, when these kind of populist notions, the United Nation faces a conflictual situation with others, arises. It's almost never true in the modern world. George Bush was reading Winston Churchill before he went into Iraq, always a dangerous sign. So what is the response of the populists? Because you might ask the populists, well, if it's a conflictual world, what guarantees that we're going to win in this conflict? And the populist answer is, we care more about it. We're determined to win. We will bargain harder. This is exactly the appeal that the Brexiteers made in Britain. Yeah, it's difficult to do this, but we're tough. We're going to do it. Marine Le Pen, again, has a more sophisticated version of the same rhetoric, but she argues that the real values in the international system are not the common values, not universalism of human rights values or something like that. They're the individual cultures of individual nations. And places like the IMF or elsewhere don't share this culture. And therefore, France has to defend itself. So she wants to increase French defense spending by 50%. And she says, if we are determined to do this, if the French leaders are brave, then we can defend French interests anywhere in the world. All we need is the will, right? So that's the appeal. That's the electoral appeal. When you hear about them in elections, that's what you get. So what happens when they need to implement policy? It turns out that neither of these things are true. When you implement policy, the nation is never united. There are always lots of compromises between different interests that have a say. And when you implement policy, you have to deal with other countries. And no matter how weak those other countries are, you are interdependent with them in a way that means you can never get a 100% solution that you impose on them, even if you are Donald Trump leading the United States. And so by the force of events, populists are time and time again forced to backtrack. So let's see how this works. First, domestic politics is pluralist, not consensual. There are lots of different interests. So what happens to right-wingers? First, they almost never get elected. When they do get elected, they have to go into a coalition, and the coalition waters down their view. And even when they rule the whole country, then they end up being constrained by their external environment, that it really isn't the interest of the country to pursue these policies. The first example of not being elected is Marine Le Pen. The second example of coalitions is a place like Austria or currently Italy. And the third example is a place like Hungary or Trump, so I'll go through these. First of all, right-wing populists are smaller than you think. They aren't really a governing majority, a real majority, anywhere except Hungary, and that's under pretty suspicious circumstances. Often they can't get into office at all. A good example is Marine Le Pen. I counted it because I'm a social scientist. there were over 10,000 articles published in the English language press on the potential election of Marine Le Pen to be president of France. In the 1 month before the French election, Marine Le Pen was a person who could never, 0% probability, be elected president of France. She was beaten double digits in the polls by everybody she could possibly have run against, and she lost 2-1, right? But nonetheless, we're told over and over again, this is a real threat. UKIP and the BNP have never held significant domestic office. They can only win in a faux election like the European parliamentary elections. We can talk about that later. AfD has no power in Germany. The Dutch right is excluded, and so on. So populists really struggle to even get the political power in most places to have any impact at all. Look at Marine Le Pen. It's not just that she lost 2-1, but look at the power of the Rassemblement National in France. It's tiny. Actually, the European parliamentary elections are atypically strong showing for them, and they only got about 25%. This is not a powerful political movement that's easily going to govern on its own. Same thing in the European parliamentary elections. Everybody talked about the decline of the Social Democrats and the People's Party. But if you look at all the pro-European parties, which is the line there, it's almost exactly the same as it was before. And if you actually look more closely at what happened up here, there's a slight increase in the number of strongly anti-European parties, Eurosceptical right-wing parties. But most of that is due to British conservatives who were Eurosceptic being kicked out and replaced by Brexit Party people. So in fact, the numbers are misleading. The change is very small, and these people don't have anywhere close to a majority in Europe. What's the result? The result is they start to change their views. Look at Marine Le Pen. In 2004 to 2006, she favored a Frexit and she wanted to pull out of the euro. In 2017, when she was running for president, she was very ambivalent. It was very hard to figure out exactly what her policy was. Lots of barking, not much policy. And now she's formally renounced leaving Europe and the euro. Why? Because the structure of politics forces her to do it. She has to go toward the middle if she wants to get elected. And for these reasons, and because of the obvious failure of Brexit, we no longer hear about the spread of these radically anti-European policies. A country like Hungary never has mentioned it, and other countries have stopped doing so. And in any case, all these populists have different specific concerns on which they don't agree. So we're not going to see a great spread of these policies over time, because it is hard for these people to get elected if they hold these views, and therefore they moderate them. Then there's the case of coalitions. So suppose you do get elected in a country, like suppose you're the Freedom Party in Austria. What happens to you? You get destroyed. So in 2000 to 2007, and in the recent government, there's been a coalition party in Austria, as we all know, containing radical right people. And what did the government do? It pursued pro-European policies. It pursued a successful European presidency in both cases. And it weakened the extremists in both cases. These are the most recent European Parliament results. And you can see the FPÖ is your standard vote total for a right-wing populist group in Central Europe, somewhere between 15 and 20%. The only salient political policy issue on which they've had serious impact is migration. And as I said before, their view is mainstream. I had this strange experience recently of sitting at lunch alone with Sebastian Kurz, the head of the Austrian government, in Montana, one of these weird conference experiences. Nobody knew who he was. And so I sat to him, talked to him for an hour, and the first question, of course, was, what's it like to rule with the far right? And he said, not a problem. He said, they want some positions in various ministries. They want some control over the police. They want our migration policy to change, which I support. And otherwise, I said to them, you take that and I'll run the policy. Thank you very much. And the result is that you get a pro-European policy. Then there's the case of Hungary. Suppose you get elected and you have a majority. So we should see Orban doing all this wonderful anti-European stuff, but does he? Hungary's taken a cooperative position on almost all EU and NATO issues. Of course, they don't talk that way, and they often send out a press release saying they're doing differently. And there are these little issues, you know, are there Russians spying there? What about Ukraine and the Hungarians, and so on and so forth. But on the big issues, they back down. And Orban is a genius. You have to give him credit for that. He is a genius at picking an insignificant issue, like migrant quotas, and making it a big deal by running a referendum on it. In fact, the issue didn't matter much, hiding the fact that he's totally supporting the European position on the important issue, which is restrictions on migration from outside. Whether we like that policy or not, that is the European consensual policy, and Orban is 100% behind it. He's also behind the assistance to Africa to support it, even though he says he's not. So these people are playing this bark and bite game very skillfully. Now let me say, I'm not supporting the populists, as Chris said. I think what's going on in Hungary in domestic politics is a bad thing. I have relatives there. It's an important issue for me. But facts are facts. And on foreign policy, Hungary is not behaving particularly badly. So then we have the issue of interstate politics. So you have first the problem that it's not really in the interest of the countries that elect populist governments to engage in highly conflictual behavior internationally. But they also lacked the capability to actually achieve those goals, even if they wanted to. This is the story of Brexit, right? It starts with the simple fact that Britain didn't really have an interest in pulling out of most of the EU common policies. It just wanted to change some of them, notably migration. Most of the other ones, it proposed and would have been happy to just accept the status quo almost across the board. That's because it's highly interdependent with Europe and there is no alternative. So that's what we talked about before. But suppose Britain really wanted to bargain hard. Suppose you're a true believer in Brexit and you think, okay, let's have an independent trade policy, let's sign deals with people, let's do things completely differently. This option is totally non-credible. It's crazy to think that you're going to get a better deal negotiating with India or China or Russia, the WTO or Donald Trump than you will with Europe. And in fact, it's impossible to realize in anything like real time. Trade negotiations take decades. And even on individual issues, Britain lacks the bargaining power to achieve what it wants to achieve. Bargaining power in international trade negotiations in the simplest possible model are a function of the percentage of GDP that you export. And Britain is far more trade dependent on Europe, far more investment dependent than Europe is on it. So Britain's negotiating position was from the start going to be weak, and that's what it proved to be, which is why the history of Brexit over 2 years is a history of British concessions. So what do the British do? They bluff. They say, well, we really are determined, we're really going to be tough. I love David Davis's kind of ambivalent way of expressing this. If you go to buy a house and you tell the person you're buying from, it's the only house I'm going to buy, does the price go up or down? Of course we have options open. It's only sensible. But does he really have options open, or did he just say he has options open? I think what we've seen in the last 2.5 years is the Brexiteers talk as if they have options, but they can never pull the trigger on those options because they don't exist. One other small point about this, which is it's not just the fact that Britain lacks the interest and the power to negotiate a a Brexit that would be favorable to the hard Brexit point of view. It lacks the capacity, the technical capacity. What people forget about international organizations is that they are designed to manage that complexity by creating simple rules that all countries follow so they don't have to constantly renegotiate hundreds of thousands of regulations. So a conservative estimate of the number of EU directives, regulations, and rules implemented by the UK Parliament is 35,000. I think that's almost an order of magnitude low, actually, but even that number is so large that you can't imagine Britain renegotiating, rethinking, rewriting all that stuff in a short period of time. Even more in the WTO. And then Britain would have to renegotiate that with every country in the world because many agreements, particularly on services, are now country-specific. So you imagine you're talking about potentially millions of negotiations. And the purpose of international organizations like the EU and the WTO is to reduce that complexity. Britain had benefited from that, which is why it was reported in the Financial Times that Britain only had 10 active trade negotiators at the time of Brexit, because you didn't need them. You were subject to a rule-governed international system. You pull out, you need to have people capable of negotiating 1 million agreements with the rest of the world. And that's not a feasible technical goal. When David Davies was asked about this, Winston Churchill reared his ugly head again. If our country can deal with World War II, it can deal with this. He was actually talking about the logistics of managing this. But comparisons of Brexit to World War II are silly, precisely because the gains from doing so are less. So if we were to add all that up in Brexit, you would see that Britain doesn't really have an interest in pulling out, that the electoral rhetoric doesn't match the implementation rhetoric, that Britain starts by making a populist pitch that all we want is sovereignty, independence, democracy. But when you implement, what you want is 1 million agreements of a certain kind. That's a very different politics and a very different task, and one that the populists are not particularly good at delivering. Even if they were, they tell you, we're going to get what you want because we're tough, we're determined. But in real international politics, how much power you have depends on your interdependence relationships and how much you value them, or what political scientists call asymmetrical interdependence. So Britain ends up with a cooperative solution. And finally, populists tell you it's simple, but when you actually realize it, it turns out to be very complex. Let me, before I conclude, talk about Trump. So you might say, okay, maybe Orban hasn't done much, maybe Salvini hasn't done much yet, maybe the Brexit thing was mismanaged, but Trump's an important guy, right? Well, he's more important. He can do more because his country is more powerful, and because the presidency of the United States is a powerful office. So the two constraints I talked about, domestic politics and international politics, are lessened a little bit. But the truth is, when you look at Trump's foreign policy, it's remarkably ineffectual. So there are two things that he has really done that matter a lot. Tariffs on Chinese goods, although those are bargaining tariffs, so supposedly they're supposed to go away at some point, and Iran sanctions, though that was a policy supported even before the election by the Republican Congress. But still, you can argue another president would not have done as he did there. Those are important things. But what else is there, actually? So when you look at his other policies, most of them are pretty insignificant. There's symbolic things like pulling out of the Paris Accord. For the United States, the Paris Accord meant nothing because it didn't commit the United States to do anything, and the Congress signed it in that way, and the process doesn't commit the United States to do anything. Most of the action in the United States is at the state and local level anyway, and they're still involved. moving the Israeli embassy, as I said, the announcement about the Golan Heights being part of Israel, and so on. Then there are policies that are just more or less the same. Our policy toward North Korea, as I said, toward Saudi Arabia. Trade agreements, very interesting. Look at the NAFTA agreement, or the renegotiation of NAFTA, which might never be ratified anyway, and the agreement with Korea. Trump talked about these trade agreements as if they were the biggest problem facing the United States, but when you read the text, the changes are very small. Cuba, Afghanistan, this was the issue Trump most cared about. He wanted to pull the United States out of Afghanistan. For 7 months, he fought in the White House to try to get that view achieved. And then in the late August, I think August 23rd, 24th of his first year in office, a date that is probably the date in the year where the least number of people are watching television or reading the news. Trump gave a speech, and he said, well, you know, and this is my favorite Trump quote, things look very different when you're inside the Oval Office as president. So I guess we're going to increase our troop presence in Afghanistan. You know, and why? Because I think he feared the embarrassing outcome that might happen if he pulled out, and what's more, did so over Pentagon objections. Syria, where of all people, John Bolton, the crazy man of American foreign policy, had to walk back Trump's statements. Pulling out of Japan, South Korea, NATO. Well, what about all those threats about NATO if they don't spend more money? Gone, right? So most of this stuff is just fake. And Trump is politically savvy to focus on domestic policies, the treatment of migrants at home, maybe building a wall on the border, or tax cutting that he can control with the help of the Republican Party. All right, final point, and then I'm done. If I'm right, if this analysis is right, and populists in foreign policy are all bark and no bite, why does everybody think the opposite? Why is there all this talk about the decline of the global liberal order and so on? And I think that's because in the public debate, nobody has an incentive to say the emperor has no clothes, okay? Who are these people who are conspiring, or anyway colluding, to disguise the fact that populism is very ineffective at pursuing foreign policy? Okay, first of all, both populist politicians and their opponents. Obviously, populists want to talk as if they're effective, but interestingly, so do their opponents. I'm sure many of you are skeptical of populist views, and you'll probably be the first people to stand up and criticize what I'm saying right here and right now. That's what happens in the United States. My most vicious critics are my fellow people on the Democratic side who say, you're making light of Trump. You're making it seem as if Trump isn't important. I'm just stating the facts. In foreign policy, with the exception of the Chinese tariffs and Iran, hasn't done much. Journalists, commentators, and policy analysts. Trump, Salvini, Orban, Brexit are irresistible stories. Just like I said with Marine Le Pen, all those stories about her becoming president of France when she couldn't, this story writes itself. It sells newspapers. CNN has changed its position politically as a function of this story. So it's impossible for journalists and commentators to resist this. And the result is we hear day in and day out, if we're newspaper readers, that this is the issue. Finally, scholars. I'm ashamed to say my own profession, people want to be part of the game, with the quasi-exception of Cass Muda, who talked earlier in this session, who sometimes hints at a bit of skepticism about how much populists actually achieve, or how bad it is. But even so, most people uniformly in my academic community treat it as important. Let me give you one example and then I'll stop. The Golan Heights announcement. You'll remember President Trump announced, to try to help Benjamin Netanyahu get reelected, that the United States now supported the Israel annexing the Golan Heights from Syria. So when the New York Times runs the story, this is what you see on the front page. Trump reverses core policy tenet on Golan Heights. The paper lands on my table in the morning, and I thought, oh no, there's an example that disproves my hypothesis, right? I thought, well, that's a really important policy. But then you look more closely and compare the headline to what's down here in paragraph 5 of the story. What's in paragraph 5? In paragraph 5, it says, as a practical matter, Mr. Trump's announcement changes little. There's no negotiation underway under the status of Golan Heights, nor any expectation that Israel is going to withdraw from it. The United States could veto any United States Security Council resolution condemning the move anyway. That is typical of journalistic coverage of populists. So whatever your political position is, I think that when we analyze this, we should think of populists as being all bark and no bite on foreign policy. I know many of you disagree with this, so I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for that very stimulating and also at times provocative talk. I'm sure there will be lots of comments and questions in the audience. We've got about 20 to 25 minutes. And so I'm open to, if you raise your hand, then I'll take some questions. Yes, a gentleman in the about 5th row over there. If you could wait for the mic as well, please. Thank you.
Thank you. It's always fascinating to listen to Andrew MORAVCSIK presentations, and it was somehow reassuring in a way. But there is an element that I'm afraid was missing in the presentation, and there is an element of disagreement. And it is the following. You didn't touch about the very strong capacity of populist forces to shape the political agenda. They may not be influential in service, in the implementation, but they have a tremendous capacity to drive the political agenda, and this is extremely dangerous in my view. I tell you two examples of this. The first one is about the one you mentioned, about migration. If there is strong consensus in European politics on migration, it is precisely because of the very strong capacity of populist forces to drive the agenda in that topic. The second example is about the capacity also in the last European elections to reshape the political debate from what used to be the left and right cleavage, and so discussions on social inequality or other issues concerning social justice to other topics, and in particular it changed the coordinates in the direction of a conflict between Europeanist forces and populist forces, which changes in a way the game. Thank you.
Should I answer now? Very good question. When people talk about the power of populists to shape the public debate, the example they always use is the one you used, migration. But the reason populists can shape that issue is because it's generally an issue of concern. For example, British people were polled for the last 17 years. And in every year, except the year of the Brexit referendum itself, when asked, what foreign policy issue do you care about most, they said migration. And when they said, what do you want to do about it, they said less, right? The public opinion numbers I showed here are extraordinarily stable across every kind of country, countries that have active populist parties, countries that don't. They've been stable for decades, right? So in political science, you distinguish between issues that are underlying salient cleavage issues that seem to be fixed in the population no matter what the institutions or the parties, and issues that can be manipulated by politicians because public views are not set or not strong. And so I think it's far-fetched, given the uniformity of the view in any kind of a situation, that to simply blame views on migration on populist parties. The populist parties are able to do that because they have a political opportunity to do that because other parties tried to suppress the issue. But in the end, that issue bubbled up. That was a political opportunity that was there. So to put it another way, my interpretation is that migration helps cause the populists rise, not vice versa. And it creates a political opportunity. Now, I agree that political opportunity is quite symbolic in some ways, as well as being practical. So it's not as if it's always the people who are most hurt in their wages or something by migration who are those who speak up. But still, the issue doesn't get created by a policy party. By a populist party. It pre-exists them. But that's an important empirical debate people could have, but I think the evidence pretty strongly supports that across the board. We'll see what happens with the recent elections. So my sense is that the focus of debate will not be pro-European, anti-European, because the anti-Europeans will be excluded from the ruling group anyway in the European Parliament, as they have been since always. But instead, what will happen is you'll have a much more fine-grained debate between the traditional parties in the European Parliament, the People's Parties and the Social Democrats, and liberals and Greens, including En Marche, about what the policies are that the European Union should propose. Some of them may fall into a right-left cleavage. Some of them may fall on a different kind of cleavage, say the environment. But still, it seems to me unlikely that the European Parliament could or would profitably have any more debate about this than it's had before. Because actually the total strength of the anti-European forces is not appreciably different than it was previously. So there's a certain amount of headline-making events in the European Parliament on that cleavage, but the rest of it is business as usual.
Okay, other questions? There's a woman right at the back who's standing up.
Hi, Professor MORAVCSIK. I'm Caterina Paolucci from James Madison University in Florence. So you, of course, your lecture was about the foreign policies of the populist parties, but what about the national policies, the internal policies? And don't you think that those could eventually trickle down onto the international sphere as well? So in other words, do the populists have any impact on national politics? And would this not impact on the global sphere? For instance, the fact that now there is a legitimation, in a way, of nationalist talk. There is no sanction anymore on nationalism, on sovranismo, on these kinds of concepts and ideologies. Would that not lead to an international arena that is more conflictual, where everybody fights for themselves instead than cooperation? So aren't we moving from a very cooperative kind of dialogue internationally to a more conflictual? And does discourse not influence then politics? You seem to think that these are two separate spheres, the one of discourse and the one of real facts, but do these not have anything to do with each other?
So I see that as two good questions. One is whether domestic politics affects international politics. The other is whether discourse affects action. So on domestic politics, I think there are some issues that countries pursue, notably how they treat foreign nationals within their jurisdiction, which do spill over. I think, as with all governments, some of the decisions that a populist government would make, say increasing defense spending in the United States, might have an effect internationally, though interestingly, that's not a populist policy, that's a Republican policy. Trump, we should remember, was opposed to increasing defense spending. It's the Republicans that want to increase it, and every Republican administration wants to do that. On your second question, I'm actually a skeptic about this. Lots of people who work in the international community think of the discourse, the feeling in the room of diplomats as affecting a lot of things. I think less so. And I think the discourse changes remarkably quickly. Let me give you one example. In general, Republicans are far less positively viewed by the rest of the world than Democrats in the United States. So the numbers of people critical of Trump internationally, it's about 70%, exactly the same numbers as for Bush. What's interesting is when a Democrat gets elected, boom, in a month, they switch. And if you ask yourself what happens in those 8 years when the Republican is in office, the answer is the Republicans moderate to the international system, not the reverse. So if you look at the second Bush administration, first Bush administration starts the Iraq War, does all this stuff. Second Bush administration cozies up to Europe, behaves much more soundly. So I think that, in fact, the force of events, particularly the need to manage complicated issues, slowly forces countries toward this convergent policy, which was the theme of my talk. And I think that people's rhetoric simply adjusts to that. I actually think that the political world is remarkably Orwellian. We are capable of changing our beliefs amazingly quickly about some of these issues, and people do it. Because the force of events pushes them that way. You might think that that's a naively, soberly, almost technocratic view of the world. It's not. It's very political. I think many of these issues are not the optimal technocratic policy. They're political compromises, but they have a tremendous force. And that's what you see in the case of something like Brexit, where no matter how much you talk about it, you can't change the facts on the ground.
Okay, there's a woman on the other side. Do you want to, with a red top on?
Thank you for your presentation, Professor MORAVCSIK. I'm a political theorist and I work on foreign policy as a states agency. I have a doubt regarding your account of how framing is important for proposing political foreign policy views. And I'm thinking, why are the others not able to frame in a simple manner foreign policy issues? And there's another question which is linked to it and which makes me think that in general, middle-sized powers have lost the capacity of doing an effective foreign policy. So how can we always think that not acting in foreign policy when other governments, non-populist governments, are in power, really then gives us the resources to fight something on people who are capable of doing these very simple and fascinating messages? I mean, if everything is simple, everybody's voting for simpleness. Thanks.
So I think that one way to talk about the politics, the politics of the discourse, consistent with my view, is if you ask why the left-wing parties or the non-populist parties have had difficulty matching right-wing populist rhetoric. So all political parties are limited. They face a tension between appealing to the voters as a whole and appealing to their base. And the parties that on the moderate side have been limited by two things. They're afraid to criticize migration, even though everybody supports restrictions on migration and even though they implement restrictions on migration. So whatever else you think about Salvini, he's totally right about Macron, which is Macron says that Salvini's being outlandish in what he's saying, but also restricts migration just as tough. All you need to do is go to the Italian-French border and look at the cops on the other side who beat people up who cross, and you know that this is true, right? So, but he's not in a position to take credit for that. with the result that Salvini can take credit for all the sleazy deals that were done on the beaches of Libya to stop people from coming. And the same thing is true with macroeconomic policy. Macroeconomic policy for a country like Italy under the euro is a disaster. The euro is not helping. It might not be the only factor, but it's not helping. But moderate parties have a great deal of difficulty raising that issue because they're pro-European. And so they get caught between these two. What happens is new parties come in and they're not limited by these previously held positions and interest groups within them, and they take a more position that's better shaped toward the electorate. So if I were a moderate party, I would try to be more nuanced in my support for Europe, treat it more as a pragmatic thing and less as an ideal thing. And I would be willing to say, look, our job is to provide security for Italians, and that security involves border security, and that's fine. And every government does that. And establish your credibility. And if you establish your credibility with the voters, then 5 years down the line, you can move toward a more sensible migration policy where you're letting people in a controlled way to help the economy, to generate whatever goals you want to generate. But I think these issues have been mismanaged by other parties. But that's precisely because I'm taking the view from the start that these issues exist. They aren't just manufactured by people. Political parties take opportunities on the big issues. Little issues you can play with, but big issues like migration and macroeconomic policy, you as a politician have to adapt to it. And I think the existing parties are both limited and made some bad choices about that. You see that also with the British Labour Party in a hopeless situation trying to figure out what its position should be vis-a-vis Brexit, when it's pretty obvious, as Chris mentioned to me, that strategically probably would make more sense to be in favor of a referendum or remain.
I'm just going to abuse my position as chair very briefly to ask a question myself, which is that you've been talking about the sort of force that keeps populism in foreign policy in check. And is there not sometimes a counterforce, which is that the base of the populist parties will push them in another direction? So in the Conservative Party in my country, it's pretty clear that whoever wins the leadership election has to appeal to the 100,000 or so members by saying that he or she will take an extremely tough attitude on Brexit. And while then the new leader will face exactly the same trade-offs as Theresa May's faced, doesn't it mean that it makes an accident more likely to happen?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think that the tension again is this tension between the powerful minorities within parties and the party as a whole. So what's interesting about the Conservative Party is that the parliamentary party doesn't favor the hard leave position. The electorate is ambivalent, but the party members are very powerful. And it really depends on how your polity is organized. The Anglo-Saxon countries, despite their intense pride in their written or unwritten constitutions, have terrible systems when it comes to dealing with this because they're majoritarian. And so if a small group can capture a party, their power is multiplied, whereas in a parliamentary system, they still have to form coalitions. It's much more difficult to impose your view. And so I think that you're right. The British system should equilibrate. It's hard to see how a parliamentary vote could be taken that would support a no-deal Brexit. But the one thing that makes that a chancy proposition is the internal organization of parties. So that is the weak link.
Okay, I think we've got time for one or maybe two more questions. There's a woman just here in the fourth row.
Thank you. I have a question that sort of follows on from other people, but it would be more about the actors of international relations and local level implementation. You mentioned the Paris Accords and how subnational actors do play some role in foreign policy in that sense, in its implementation on the ground. And I wonder if we see at the same time that populists often do a lot better in local or provincial elections than they do in national elections. What happens there? Do we see the same sort of pattern that you've argued about moderation through actual holding of office? Thanks.
Well, they tend to do well in local or locally organized elections because locally organized elections are jurisdictionally unrepresentative. That is, some jurisdictions are overrepresented, but they don't do particularly well in cities. And it's really cities where 70% of the people in most countries live that are at the forefront of most of these issues where subnational actors move forward, particularly if you're viewing that from a progressive standpoint. So I think it's unlikely we would move to a world where cities would be dominated by right-wing nationalist populist governments. I mean, that would be, from an electoral standpoint, an almost impossible lift for people. But it's true that in some jurisdictions, if you draw a map of a country, most of the map looks the color of populism, but that's because you have these enormous empty jurisdictions. It's like the United States, the Western United States. I mean, there's Wyoming, yeah, okay, but what matters for climate change policy is New York City and San Francisco.
Okay, one more question, if there is any. Did you? Yes. We have the mic down here at the front.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much. And as a British person, I certainly agree with you that Nigel Farage is barking. Leaving that aside, the essence of your talk, which certainly encouraged me a great deal, is ultimately that even populists are rational. And I'd come back slightly to the question that Mr. Giles asked you. Are you really quite so certain that the current leadership of the Conservative Party is going to take a rational position, and that some of the deep identity issues of sovereignty and the historical development of Britain under the European community is going to be, in a sense, pushed down, and that rationality will ultimately prevail? And secondly, and this is what Mr. Giles was saying, there is a danger of riding a tiger, that you set off emotions in the mass of the population which are really, really difficult to control.
I think that populist leaders are rational, but not in the sense that you, I think, are implying that I think they're rational. I don't think they're rational technocrats. I don't even think they care about, what are the aggregate GNP goes up. Very few people do in politics, despite what economists teach us about what they should think. But I think they are politically rational. So I wrote a piece in the Financial Times 3 months before the referendum, predicting that even if the referendum passed, Brexit would be unsustainable. And the argument was, based at that time on the presupposition that Boris Johnson would be prime minister, was that to save his own political skin, he was going to have to make this very calculation that even if populists don't care about the technocratic rationality of the policy, they are good political thinkers. A lot of things you can say about Matteo Salvini, but that he's a good political thinker. And Boris Johnson is, at the very least, an opportunist who can think rationally in the short term. And my argument is essentially that the populists do not have the clout to rule alone. And their natural allies are people that don't support a lot of this stuff. And if they were to implement it, despite the opposition of those allies, much of it would be disastrous, and that would undermine their public support. Therefore, if they can just make a simple political calculation, this is where they're going to come out. In that sense, I think they are rational. And I think, in fact, they're in many ways more rational for the reasons we talked about than their opponents. And it's that political rationality that I'm trusting to limit the populist threat.
Well, I think time is unfortunately up now. That was an extremely stimulative and sometimes provocative just over an hour with the message that for if people are worried about populism, the hope that checks and balances, particularly in the international order, will moderate the bite of populists, if not their bark. I would like to thank, and I hope we can all thank, Professor MORAVCSIK very much for a great session. Thank you very much.